Winston Churchill, the lion who saved civilization. The Vigil. The morning comes slowly to London on January 24, 1965. Dawn breaks over Hyde Park Gate, painting the winter sky in shades of pearl and ash. Inside number 28, the house stands silent. No movement stirs the curtains, no footsteps echo in the halls. For 9 days, the world has held its breath, waiting for news that everyone knows must come. At precisely 8:35 in the morning, a physician emerges to face the gathered press. His words are simple, measured, final. Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, the man who defied Hitler when all seemed lost, the voice that rallied millions through their darkest hour, the last lion of the British Empire, has died at the age of 90. The coincidence sends a shiver through those who remember. 70 years earlier, to the very day, Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had died in this same city, his mind destroyed by illness, his brilliant political career ended in disgrace and disappointment. The son had spent his entire life trying to prove something to a father who never believed in him, who never lived to see that the boy he considered a failure would become the man who saved Western civilization. But that story, that extraordinary journey from neglected child to the greatest statesman of the 20th century, begins not in this quiet London house, but in the grandest palace in all of England. Blood and Birthright. November 30th, 1874, Blenheim Palace rises from the Oxfordshire countryside like a monument to power itself. 200 rooms spread across 7 acres of building. Gardens stretch to the horizon. This is not merely a home, but a statement, built by a grateful nation for John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, the military genius who saved Europe from Louis XIV. It is here, in this temple of aristocratic glory, that Jenny Jerome Churchill feels the first sharp pains of labour. The baby is coming too soon, 2 months before expected. There is no time to return to London, no time for proper preparations. In a ground-floor room hastily converted for the purpose, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill enters the world 7 weeks premature, already in a hurry, already refusing to wait. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, is the second son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. He will inherit neither title nor palace, but he carries the blood of England's greatest military dynasty. His mother, Jenny, is the daughter of Leonard Jerome, an American millionaire and financier. She is considered one of the most beautiful women in British society, with dark eyes that captivate everyone she meets. The marriage between British aristocracy and American wealth should have been perfect. Instead, it becomes a cold arrangement where duty replaces affection and absence becomes routine. Winston grows up in the vast halls of privilege, but without the warmth that should fill them. His parents are strangers who appear at dinners and formal occasions, remote as royalty, beautiful as portraits. Lord Randolph pursues his meteoric political career with single-minded intensity. By 1876, when Winston is barely 2 years old, the family moves to Dublin, where his grandfather serves as Viceroy of Ireland. It is in that Dublin residence that Winston's brother Jack is born in 1880. The two boys will remain close throughout their lives, but even Jack cannot fill the emptiness created by parents who see their children as accessories to their social position. Into this void steps Elizabeth Everest, a woman in her 40s hired as a nurse when Winston is just months old. He calls her Womb, later Womany. To him, she becomes everything that parents should be, but are not. Mrs. Everest tends his cuts and bruises. She sits with him when he is sick. She listens when he pours out his troubles. Years later, Churchill will write with aching honesty that Mrs. Everest was his dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years he lived with her presence in his life. She is not paid to love him, yet she does. She has no obligation to see his worth, yet she does. In a childhood starved of affection, she is the one constant source of unconditional devotion. But even her love cannot protect him from the brutality of upper-class British education. In 1882, 2 months before his 8th birthday, Winston is sent to St. George's School in Berkshire. Place is a nightmare made real. Flogging with birch rods is a regular feature of its curriculum. The headmaster believes in breaking the spirit before moulding the mind. Winston, sensitive and imaginative, suffers terribly. He later writes that he was taken from the happiness of his nursery with all his toys and sent away from home for many weeks at a stretch to do lessons under masters who seemed to take pleasure in his misery. After 2 years of this torment, his parents finally transfer him to a smaller school in Hove, then to Harrow in 1888. At Harrow, Winston's academic record remains unremarkable. He struggles with Latin and mathematics. He spends years in the lowest level courses while other boys advance past him. His father, watching this mediocrity with growing disappointment, decides that Winston lacks the intelligence for university or the professions. The army, Lord Randolph concludes, is the only option for a boy of such limited ability. Winston tries 3 times to pass the entrance examination for the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. 3 times he fails. His father's assessment seems confirmed, but on the 4th attempt, something shifts. Winston passes and enters Sandhurst in 1893. Once there, freed from subjects he hates and focused on topics that interest him, his performance transforms. He graduates in 1894, 20th in a class of 130, high enough to earn a commission in the cavalry. But Lord Randolph Churchill never sees this achievement. In January 1895, shortly after Winston finishes at Sandhurst, his father dies at the age of 45. The official cause is given as an illness that has destroyed his mind, though whispers speak of other causes. Winston, now 20 years old, stands at his father's grave and makes a silent vow. He will vindicate the family name. He will achieve the greatness that his father sought and lost. He will prove that the Churchill blood still runs strong. It is a promise that will drive him for the rest of his life, an endless quest for the approval of a man who can no longer give it. 6 months later, in July 1895, Winston rushes to Crouch Hill in North London. Mrs. Everest is dying of peritonitis. He is the only member of his family who comes to her bedside. He sits with her in those final hours. He holds her hand as she slips away. Later, he arranges her funeral and pays for the tombstone that will mark her grave. He writes that she had been his dearest and most intimate friend, and he would never know such a friend again. In the span of 6 months, he has lost the father who never believed in him and the woman who always did. He is 20 years old, freshly commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, and he is utterly alone. The young lion hunts glory. Jakarta is not content to be just another peacetime cavalry officer. While other young men his age attend balls and play polo, he hungers for something more. War, he believes, is the proving ground where reputations are made. Military action is the crucible where ordinary men become legends. He uses his mother's social connections shamelessly, writing letters, pulling strings, begging for assignments anywhere shots are being fired. In the autumn of 1895, his persistence pays off. He secures permission to observe the Spanish forces fighting Cuban rebels. He travels to Cuba with his friend Reginald Barnes, and on November 30th, his 21st birthday, he experiences combat for the first time. Bullets crack past his head. Men fall beside him. He finds the experience exhilarating. This is what he was born for. He also discovers a second talent. The Daily Graphic agrees to publish his dispatches from Cuba. Churchill, the war correspondent, is born alongside Churchill, the soldier. He realizes that writing about conflict can be as valuable as fighting in it. Words, properly wielded, can build a reputation as surely as acts of valor. When he returns to England, he is a published author with money in his pocket. It is not nearly enough. DISRA 6, his regiment deploys to India. For most officers, this is a routine posting involving endless drills and suffocating boredom in the colonial heat. For Churchill, it is intolerable unless he can find action. He reads voraciously, educating himself in history and philosophy to make up for his weak academic background. He plays polo with fierce competitiveness, and he watches the frontier, waiting for an opportunity. In 1897, that opportunity arrives. Pashtun tribes are in revolt on the northwest frontier, and a military expedition is being organized to suppress them. Churchill pulls every string available to get himself attached to the Malakand field force. The campaign is brutal and unforgiving. The terrain is mountainous and hostile. The tribesmen are expert fighters who know every rock and valley. Churchill rides his grey pony along the skirmish lines in full view of the enemy, deliberately exposing himself to fire. It is foolish, perhaps even suicidal, but he plays for high stakes. Given an audience, there is no act too daring or too noble. He fights in multiple engagements. He sees men killed at close range. He helps carry wounded soldiers to safety. He shoots enemies at point-blank range during a desperate rearguard action. When he returns to India, he writes a book about the campaign, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, published in 1898. The book is a success. Young Mr. Churchill is becoming known, but he wants more. In 1898, he learns that Lord Kitchener is organizing an expedition to reconquer Sudan from the forces of the Mahdi, a religious leader who had previously humiliated Britain by killing General Gordon at Khartoum. Kitchener does not want Churchill, considers him an upstart and a publicity seeker. Churchill bombards the War Office with letters. He enlists his mother to pressure her social connections. Finally, against Kitchener's wishes, Churchill is attached to the 21st Lancers. In September 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman, Churchill participates in what would be one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history. The Lancers, 400 strong, thunder across the desert toward what appears to be a small group of enemy riflemen. Too late, they discover it is a trap. 3,000 warriors rise from a hidden ravine directly in their path. There is no time to stop or turn. The only option is to charge straight through. Churchill, armed with a Mauser pistol because an old shoulder injury prevents him from wielding a sword, gallops into the mass of spears and blades. The collision is catastrophic. Men and horses go down in a thrashing tangle of violence. Churchill fires at enemies so close he can see their faces. He aims for the bodies, maximizing his chances of hitting something in the chaos. The charge lasts perhaps 2 minutes. When the cavalry emerges on the far side, they have lost a quarter of their force. Churchill is unscathed. He will write later about the peculiar feeling of being shot at without result, that curious mixture of fear and exhilaration that defines combat. The campaign becomes his second book, The River War, published in 1899. He is now 24 years old and has fought on 3 continents. He has published 2 successful books and numerous newspaper articles. But his most dramatic adventure is still ahead. In 1899, war breaks out in South Africa between the British Empire and the Boer republics. Churchill arranges an assignment as a war correspondent for the Morning Post at the extraordinary salary of £250 per month, 4 times what he earned as an army officer. He arrives in South Africa in October 1899, hungry for glory. 1899, Churchill boards an armoured train on a reconnaissance mission near the town of Chively. The train runs into a Boer ambush. Artillery shells pound the locomotive. Rifle fire tears through the thin armour plating. The train derails, cars crashing into each other in a grinding wreck. Churchill, though technically a civilian correspondent, immediately takes charge of the rescue effort. Under heavy fire, he organizes the removal of debris from the tracks. He directs the loading of wounded men onto the engine. He walks beside the locomotive as it slowly reverses away from the ambush, encouraging the driver who wants to flee. By the time the engine is clear, Churchill is alone on foot, surrounded by Boer soldiers. He reaches for his pistol, but he left it on the train when organizing the rescue. He has no choice but to surrender. The Boers imprison him in Pretoria. For most men, this would be the end of the story. For Churchill, it is the beginning of his legend. On December 12, 1899, he escapes by scaling a wall while the guards are distracted. He has no map, no compass, no food. He speaks no Afrikaans or Dutch. The entire countryside is hostile. His chances of reaching British territory, nearly 300 miles away, are essentially zero. But he walks through the night anyway. He hides in a grove of trees during the day. When he can no longer stand the hunger and exposure, he approaches a house in a mining area and takes an enormous gamble. He knocks on the door. By pure chance, the house belongs to John Howard, the English manager of a coal mine. Howard risks everything to hide Churchill in the mine shaft. For days, Churchill lives underground, sustained by food smuggled down by sympathetic miners. Howard and his colleagues eventually hide Churchill in a shipment of wool bales on a train headed east toward Portuguese East Africa. For 3 days, Churchill lies motionless in the suffocating darkness among the wool. When the train finally crosses into neutral territory, he emerges. The story of his capture and escape spreads across the world. When he returns to British lines, he is mobbed by cheering soldiers. Newspapers in London print his account. He is no longer just another soldier or correspondent. He is a genuine hero, a man who dared the impossible and succeeded. The rising politician. Churchill returns to England in July 1900 as a celebrity. He has fought in 4 wars, published 5 books, and escaped from a prisoner of war camp. He is 25 years old and ready for the next challenge. Politics, he has decided, is where true power lies. In October 1900, he stands for Parliament as the Conservative candidate for Oldham, a textile town in Lancashire. The voters, impressed by his military record and his famous name, elect him. Winston Churchill enters the House of Commons with the same aggressive confidence he showed on the battlefield. Almost immediately, he makes enemies within his own party. Churchill is not interested in obedience or conformity. When he disagrees with conservative policies on trade and tariffs, he says so publicly and forcefully. His father had been a conservative, but Winston refuses to worship inherited positions. In 1904, after months of growing tension, he walks across the floor of the House of Commons and joins the Liberal Party. The Conservatives consider him a traitor. Churchill considers himself honest. Crimson Choose proves extraordinarily beneficial. The Liberals win a landslide victory in 1906, and Churchill, at 31, becomes Under-Secretary of State for the colonies. 2 years later, he rises to President of the Board of Trade, giving him a seat in the cabinet. He throws himself into social reform with the same intensity he once brought to military campaigns. He helps create labor exchanges to match unemployed workers with available jobs. He advocates for minimum wages in certain industries. He supports old age pensions and unemployment insurance. These are radical ideas in Edwardian England, and Churchill champions them with passionate speeches that echo through Parliament. Foreclosure. On September 12, 1908, Churchill marries Clementine Hosier, a beautiful and intelligent woman from an aristocratic but financially troubled family. They meet at a dinner party. They fall in love quickly. The marriage, unlike his parents' cold arrangement, is based on genuine affection and mutual respect. Clementine becomes his anchor, his advisor, his fiercest defender. She will remain by his side through triumph and disaster for 57 years. Their first child, Diana, is born in 1909. Their son, Randolph, follows in 1911. In 1910, Churchill becomes Home Secretary, one of the great offices of state. But in 1911, he achieves his true ambition. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith appoints him First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. It is the perfect position for a man who loves military matters and grand strategy. Churchill arrives at the Admiralty like a storm, full of energy and ideas. He is certain that war with Germany is coming. He has watched the Kaiser's naval build-up with growing alarm. He has studied the balance of power in Europe and concluded that conflict is inevitable. If Britain is to survive that war, the Royal Navy must be ready. Churchill modernizes the fleet with ruthless efficiency. He converts British battleships from coal to oil, making them faster and more efficient. He increases construction of dreadnought battleships and battlecruisers. He improves conditions for sailors, raising their pay and reforming discipline. He pushes for the development of military aviation, seeing its potential before most officers do. He visits bases and ships constantly, inspecting, questioning, demanding improvements. When World War I begins in August 1914, the Royal Navy is as prepared as Churchill can make it. The Grand Fleet moves to its war stations. The signal goes out across the Empire. Britain is at war. The Dardanelles and disgrace. The first months of World War I shatter every assumption about modern warfare. Everyone expects a short, decisive conflict. Instead, the armies of Europe plunge into a grinding nightmare of trench warfare. By the end of 1914, a continuous line of trenches stretches from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a 500-mile scar across France and Belgium. Attempts to break through cost hundreds of thousands of lives and achieve nothing. The Western Front becomes a charnel house where men die by the acre for gains measured in yards. Churchill, watching this futility from London, becomes convinced that there must be another way. In January 1915, he proposes a bold alternative. Instead of beating against the German lines in France, Britain should strike at the weakest member of the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire, Turkey, has joined Germany and Austria-Hungary in the war. If British and French naval forces can force the Dardanelles Strait, they can threaten Constantinople directly. The Ottoman Empire will collapse. A supply route to Russia will open through the Black Sea. Neutral nations like Bulgaria and Romania might join the Allies. It is a strategic vision of brilliant scope. Churchill champions the plan with all his formidable powers of persuasion. The War Council approves a purely naval operation. On February 19, 1915, British and French battleships begin bombarding the Turkish forts guarding the Dardanelles. The ships pound the fixed fortifications with massive shells. The forts, unable to respond effectively against moving targets at sea, take severe damage. The initial results seem promising. But the Turks have laid minefields throughout the strait, and the Allies lack enough minesweepers to clear them safely under fire. On March 18th, the Anglo-French fleet makes a major push to force the Narrows. 3 battleships strike mines and sink. 3 more are heavily damaged. Faced with these losses, the naval commander, Vice Admiral John de Robeck, orders a withdrawal. Churchill desperately wants de Robeck to try again. Naval intelligence suggests that the Turkish forts are running low on ammunition. One more push might succeed. But de Robeck decides to wait for army support. That decision proves fatal. The month-long delay allows the Turks to rush reinforcements to the Gallipoli Peninsula and strengthen their defences dramatically. When the land invasion finally begins on April 25, 1915, the element of surprise is gone. Flooring. The Allied troops, primarily British, French, Australian and New Zealand forces, land on narrow beaches overlooked by high ground. Turkish machine guns and artillery tear into the landing forces from the cliffs above. Men wade ashore into a storm of bullets. The beaches become killing grounds. Those who survive the initial landing find themselves pinned down, unable to advance beyond a few hundred yards. The campaign becomes a nightmare mirror of the Western Front, but with heat, disease, dysentery added to the horrors of constant combat. In the first month alone, the Allies lose 45,000 men. Through the summer and autumn of 1915, the campaign staggers forward. Additional landings at Suvla Bay in August achieve nothing. The Turks, commanded by the brilliant Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, defend every ridge and gully with skill and determination. The Allied casualties mount week by week. By the time the decision is finally made to evacuate in December 1915 and January 1916, approximately 250,000 Allied soldiers have been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Turkish casualties are similarly catastrophic, perhaps 250,000 or more. The strategic objectives have failed completely. The Ottoman Empire remains in the war. No supply route to Russia has opened. The neutral nations have not joined the Allies. It is one of the most complete military disasters in British history. Churchill becomes the scapegoat. Though many leaders had supported the operation, though the failures involved both political and military leadership, though the War Council had approved every step, the blame falls primarily on the First Lord of the Admiralty, who had promoted the plan most enthusiastically. In May 1915, as the extent of the disaster becomes clear, the Conservative Party demands Churchill's removal from the Admiralty as the price for joining a coalition government. Prime Minister Asquith has no choice but to agree. Churchill is demoted to Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a ceremonial position with no real power. For a man of Churchill's energy and ambition, this token role is unbearable. He attends War Council meetings, but can only watch as others make decisions. He offers advice that is politely ignored. By November 1915, he can stand it no longer. He resigns from the government entirely and does something that shocks British society. He requests active military service in France. In January 1916, at age 41, Lieutenant Colonel Winston Churchill takes command of the 6th Battalion, Royal Scots Fusiliers, on the Western Front. He shares the trenches with his men. He endures the mud, the lice, the constant shell fire, the casual proximity to death. He organizes raids across no man's land. He works to improve his battalion's conditions and morale. He wins the respect of soldiers who initially viewed him with suspicion as a disgraced politician playing at being a soldier. But he knows this is not his true calling. After 6 months in the trenches, when his battalion is merged with another unit, Churchill does not request a new command. Instead, he returns to Parliament in May 1916, certain that his skills are better used in politics than in warfare. For the next year, he sits on the back benches, repeatedly defending his role in the Gallipoli campaign, while conservative newspapers attack him relentlessly. The disaster haunts every speech he makes, every position he takes. Many believe his political career is permanently finished. But in July 1917, Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who has replaced Asquith, appoints Churchill as Minister of Munitions. It is not a cabinet position, and certainly not a return to his former glory, but it is a chance to prove himself. Churchill seizes the opportunity with both hands. He reorganizes munitions production with ruthless efficiency. He resolves labor disputes that could have crippled war industries. He champions the development and production of tanks, seeing them as the weapon that can finally break the trench stalemate. By April 1918, when Germany launches its final desperate offensive, Churchill's ministry delivers twice as many guns and airplanes as had been lost in the German attack, and replaces every destroyed tank with a newer, better model. He has proven that he is not just a visionary, but an effective administrator. When the war ends in November 1918, Churchill has redeemed himself through sheer competence and tireless work. The Wilderness Prophet. Wildfires. After the Great War ends, Churchill moves through a series of important positions. He serves simultaneously as Secretary of State for War and Secretary of State for Air, overseeing the demobilization of 3 million soldiers and the reshaping of British military forces for the post-war world. In 1921, he becomes Secretary of State for the Colonies, dealing with the complex aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's dissolution and the creation of new states in the Middle East. But in 1922, he loses his parliamentary seat in Dundee during a general election. For the first time since 1900, Winston Churchill is not a member of Parliament. He spends 2 years in the political wilderness, writing and reflecting. In 1924, he stands for Parliament again, this time as a Conservative representing Epping, having returned to his father's party after 2 decades as a Liberal. The Conservatives win the election, and Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin appoints Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the same position Lord Randolph Churchill had held nearly 40 years earlier. Winston has finally matched his father's highest achievement. But his tenure as Chancellor is marked by a controversial decision that will haunt Britain's economy for years. Churchill returns Britain to the gold standard at pre-war parity, making British exports expensive and contributing to economic stagnation and unemployment. When the Conservatives lose the 1929 general election, Churchill is out of office again. He is 54 years old, and many observers believe his best years are behind him. He has held high office, but has been associated with 2 major disasters, Gallipoli and the Gold Standard. He retreats to Chartwell, his beloved country home in Kent, and settles into what becomes known as his wilderness years. He writes, prolifically and successfully. He begins work on a massive 4-volume biography of his illustrious ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. He publishes articles and essays. His writing generates substantial income, which he needs because his aristocratic lifestyle constantly outpaces his earnings. But Churchill is not content to be merely a writer and a backbench member of Parliament. He watches events in Europe with growing alarm. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. Churchill immediately recognizes what many others refuse to see. This is not just another politician or another regime. This is something fundamentally dangerous to civilization itself. As early as April 1933, Churchill addresses the House of Commons about the Nazi regime, speaking of odious conditions in Germany and warning of the persecution of Jews that might spread to other countries. His warnings are dismissed as alarmist. Churchill becomes obsessed with German rearmament. He receives secret information from civil servants like Desmond Morton and Ralph Wigram, men who risk their careers to provide him with intelligence about German military development, particularly the growth of the Luftwaffe. Throughout the 1930s, Churchill speaks in Parliament, warning that Germany is rapidly overtaking Britain in air power. He calls for British rearmament. He demands increased defence spending. He argues that the balance of power in Europe is shifting dangerously in favour of the dictators. Most members of Parliament ignore him. The public, exhausted by the Great War and desperate to believe that another conflict can be avoided, does not want to hear his dire predictions. The government actively works to silence him. Geoffrey Dawson, editor of The Times, refuses to publish Churchill's articles warning about Germany. The BBC denies him airtime, claiming that political broadcasts are allocated by the political parties and that the Conservative leadership does not want Churchill representing them. He is viewed as a warmonger, a man clinging to imperial glory, someone out of step with the modern desire for peace through negotiation and compromise. His opposition to granting greater independence to India further isolates him from his own party. By the mid-1930s, Churchill is a lonely voice crying in the wilderness, dismissed by those in power as an aging has-been whose time has passed. In March 1936, Hitler sends German troops into the Rhineland, remilitarizing a zone that had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. Churchill understands the significance immediately. This is not just Hitler taking back German territory, this is the destruction of the post-war security framework. But Britain and France do nothing. The policy of appeasement, the belief that Hitler can be satisfied through reasonable concessions, dominates British politics. In 1937, Neville Chamberlain becomes Prime Minister, and appeasement becomes the official strategy. Churchill watches in anguish as Europe slides toward catastrophe. In March 1938, Germany annexes Austria. Churchill warns Parliament that the gravity of events cannot be exaggerated. In September 1938, Hitler demands the Sudetenland, the German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain flies to Munich and agrees to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in exchange for Hitler's promise that this is his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returns to London, waiving the Munich Agreement and declaring that he has achieved peace for our time. Churchill calls it a total and unmitigated defeat. He is shouted down in Parliament and vilified in the press. But in March 1939, Hitler proves Churchill right. German forces occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia, destroying the Munich Agreement and exposing appeasement as a fantasy. British public opinion finally begins to turn. People start remembering that Churchill had warned about this. In August 1939, Hitler and Stalin shock the world by signing a non-aggression pact. In September 1939, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France declare war. After nearly a decade of warnings, after years of being dismissed as a prophet of doom, Winston Churchill is vindicated. On September 3, 1939, the day Britain declares war, Prime Minister Chamberlain appoints Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty. The signal goes out to the fleet. Whether historical fact or later legend, the message carries truth. Winston is back. The hour of destiny. The first months of the war are known as the Phony War. Though Britain and France have declared war on Germany, almost no fighting occurs on the Western Front. The French army sits behind the Maginot Line. The British Expeditionary Force deploys to France but sees no action. Hitler consolidates his conquest of Poland and prepares his next move. But in April 1940, the Phony War ends. Germany invades Denmark and Norway. British and French forces attempt to defend Norway, but the operation is poorly planned and badly executed. The Allies are forced to evacuate, suffering significant losses. In Parliament, there is fury at the government's incompetent conduct of the war. On May 7 and 8, 1940, Parliament debates the Norway campaign. The debate becomes a referendum on Chamberlain's leadership. Speaker after speaker attacks the Prime Minister. Even members of his own party condemn his failures. When the vote is held, Chamberlain's majority collapses. Though he technically wins the vote, his authority is shattered. He tries to form a coalition government that includes the Labour Party, but Labour refuses to serve under him. On May 9th, Chamberlain meets with the two possible successors, Lord Halifax and Winston Churchill. Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, is the obvious choice, widely respected and politically reliable. But Halifax admits he cannot govern effectively as a member of the House of Lords rather than the Commons. The position must go to Churchill. May 10, 1940. The same morning that Chamberlain resigns, Germany invades Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The Blitzkrieg has begun. German tanks and aircraft smash through the Low Countries. The French and British armies, rushing forward to meet the invasion, drive straight into a trap. That afternoon, King George VI, who had strongly preferred Halifax, asks Churchill to form a government. Churchill later writes that he felt as if he were walking with destiny, and that all his past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. He is 65 years old. He has waited his entire life for this moment, and he receives it on the day that Hitler launches the greatest offensive in military history. Churchill forms a war cabinet that includes members of all parties. Chamberlain remains as Lord President of the Council. Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, becomes Lord Privy Seal. Lord Halifax stays on as Foreign Secretary. Churchill also creates a new position for himself, Minister of Defence, ensuring that he has direct authority over military strategy. He will not allow another Gallipoli, where political leaders lost control of operations to commanders in the field. This time, he will be responsible for everything. On May 13th, 3 days after becoming Prime Minister, Churchill addresses the House of Commons for the first time in his new role. His words are bleak and honest. He has nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Britain faces an ordeal of the 12 most grievous kind. Many long months of struggle and suffering lie ahead, but he states the war aim with absolute clarity. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. The speech electrifies some and worries others. This is not a comforting leader promising easy solutions. This is a prophet warning of the price that must be paid. The military situation deteriorates with shocking speed. The German panzers race through the Ardennes forest, a route the French High Command had considered impassable for tanks. They burst out onto the plains of northern France, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and much of the French First Army from the main body of French forces to the south. By May 20th, German tanks reach the English Channel. The Allied armies in Belgium are trapped. On May 26th, Churchill authorizes Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk. Over the next 9 days, in one of the most remarkable operations of the war, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers are rescued from the beaches by a fleet of naval vessels and civilian boats. The evacuation saves the army, but it leaves behind all its heavy equipment. Britain now faces the possibility of invasion with an army that has lost most of its tanks, artillery, and supplies. During this crisis, the War Cabinet holds a series of meetings that will determine the future of Britain and perhaps of Western civilization. Lord Halifax argues that Britain should consider approaching Mussolini to mediate a negotiated settlement with Hitler. With France collapsing and the army evacuated from Dunkirk without its equipment, Halifax believes that Britain's position is hopeless. Chamberlain, shaken by events, initially supports exploring negotiations. Churchill stands alone against them. Over 3 days of intense discussion, Churchill fights for Britain's survival not on battlefields, but in a small room at 10 Downing Street. He argues that any negotiated peace would turn Britain into a slave state under German domination. Hitler cannot be trusted to keep any agreement. Once Britain enters negotiations, the will to fight will collapse, and Hitler will dictate terms that amount to surrender. The only option, Churchill insists, is to fight on regardless of the cost. On May 28th, during the most critical moment of the debate, Churchill meets with his full cabinet, not just the War Cabinet. He tells them that if Germany defeats Britain, Hitler will force the country to sign a peace treaty that makes it a vassal state. He would rather see Britain destroyed than accept such humiliation. The cabinet ministers rise and crowd around him, offering their support. The moment of crisis passes. Halifax's proposal dies. Britain will fight on. Alone against the darkness. Camouflage. On June 4, 1940, with the Dunkirk evacuation complete, Churchill addresses Parliament. He must acknowledge a massive military defeat while simultaneously rallying the nation to continued resistance. He speaks for over 30 minutes, describing the desperate fighting in France and Belgium, the evacuation from the beaches, the losses suffered. But he ends with a peroration that becomes one of the most famous passages in the English language. Britain will go on to the end. Britain will fight in France and on the seas and oceans. Britain will fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. Britain will defend the island, whatever the cost may be. Britain will fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, fight in the fields and in the streets, fight in the hills. Britain will never surrender. The speech is delivered in the House of Commons, not broadcast to the nation, though the BBC reports on it. But its message spreads through Britain like fire. This is not a politician offering false comfort. This is a leader promising defiance. On June 16th, France requests an armistice with Germany. The French government, defeated and demoralized, asks Britain to release it from its treaty obligation to not make a separate peace. Churchill flies to France for desperate last-minute meetings, trying to keep the French in the war. He even proposes a political union between Britain and France, merging the two nations into a single state. Nothing works. On June 22nd, France signs an armistice with Germany. Britain stands alone. On June 18th, as France is collapsing, Churchill delivers another historic speech to Parliament, this one broadcast to the nation that evening. "The Battle of France is over," he declares. "The Battle of Britain is about to begin." Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization, the continuation of British institutions, the future of the British Empire. Hitler knows that he must break Britain or lose the war. Churchill calls on the British people to brace themselves and bear themselves, so that if the Commonwealth and Empire last for 1,000 years, men will still say, "This was their finest hour." It is a moment of almost unbearable rhetorical power, a leader calling his people to greatness in the face of overwhelming odds. The Battle of Britain begins in July 1940. The German Luftwaffe, with more than 2,500 aircraft, launches sustained attacks against British targets. The goal is to achieve air superiority over the English Channel and southern England, the necessary precondition for a seaborne invasion. The Royal Air Force, with fewer than 700 fighter aircraft at the start of the battle, must somehow stop them. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, fly sortie after sortie against German bombers and their fighter escorts. The margin is razor thin. If the RAF loses too many planes or too many pilots, Britain's air defences will collapse. If that happens, German troops will cross the Channel. Churchill visits fighter bases constantly. He watches operations in progress. He sees the exhausted pilots climbing into their Hurricanes and Spitfires for yet another mission. On August 20, he addresses Parliament about the battle raging overhead. He speaks of the British and Allied pilots fighting with skill and devotion. He says that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase, "the few," will define fighter command forever. Through August and into September, the battle rages. German losses mount, but so do British losses. The Luftwaffe switches tactics, abandoning attacks on airfields to focus on bombing London and other cities. This is partly in retaliation for British bombing of Berlin, but it also reflects a strategic shift. Hitler believes that breaking British civilian morale will force a surrender. The Blitz begins on September 7, 1940. Night after night, German bombers pound London. Fires rage across the city. Buildings collapse. Thousands die in the rubble. Churchill walks through the devastated neighborhoods, his presence among the ruins a symbol of defiance. He wears his dark overcoat and Homburg hat, smoking a cigar, making his V for victory sign to the crowds. When people see him, they cheer. This is what leadership looks like in Britain's darkest hour. Not a man hiding in a bunker, but a man sharing the danger with his people. The Blitz spreads to other cities. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Plymouth all suffered devastating raids. The death toll climbs into the tens of thousands. But British civilian morale does not break. The people, inspired by Churchill's rhetoric and his personal example, endure. And in the skies over England, the few continue to inflict unsustainable losses on the Luftwaffe. By the end of October 1940, Hitler postpones the invasion indefinitely. Germany has failed to achieve air superiority. Britain has survived. The island will not fall. Polishing is not victory. Britain needs help. Churchill understands that without American support, the war cannot be won. He begins a correspondence with President Franklin Roosevelt that grows into one of the most important partnerships in history. Roosevelt, constrained by American isolationism and neutrality laws, cannot openly join the war. But he finds ways to help. The Destroyers for Bases deal provides Britain with 50 aging American destroyers in exchange for base rights in British territories. More importantly, in March 1941, Congress passes the Lend-Lease Act, allowing America to supply military equipment to Britain without immediate payment. Churchill calls it the most unsordid act in history. It keeps Britain in the fight. Safeguard. On June 22, 1941, Hitler makes his greatest strategic blunder. 3 million German soldiers invade the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. Stalin, who had trusted Hitler's word, is caught completely unprepared. The Red Army reels backward under the German onslaught. Churchill, who has spent much of his career as an implacable enemy of communism, now declares that any state which fights against Nazism will have British aid. That evening, he broadcasts to the nation, explaining that Russia's cause is Britain's cause. He says that Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood. The Nazi war machine must be stopped, and if that means supporting Stalin, so be it. Ignoring the end of 1941, Britain is no longer alone. Russia is in the war. And then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler declares war on the United States. America is now fully committed to the conflict. Churchill receives the news of Pearl Harbor with what he later admits was a sense of relief so profound that he sleeps the sleep of the saved. Britain and her empire had stood alone for 18 months, facing the combined might of Germany, Italy, and Japan with limited resources and declining strength. Now the most powerful nation on earth is an ally. Victory, Churchill knows, is now assured. It will take years and cost millions of lives, but it is no longer in doubt. The Grand Alliance. Churchill travels to Washington in December 1941 for his first wartime conference with President Roosevelt. The two leaders form a remarkable partnership, despite their different backgrounds and temperaments. Roosevelt, from wealthy New York aristocracy, leads a continental power that has only recently emerged from isolation. Churchill, from British nobility, leads an empire that has spanned the globe for centuries, but is now overstretched and exhausted. Yet they find common ground in their determination to destroy Nazi Germany and their vision of a post-war world based on democratic values and international cooperation. They meet repeatedly over the next 4 years, at Casablanca, Washington, Quebec, Cairo, Tehran, Yalta. These conferences shape Allied strategy. They decide to prioritize the defeat of Germany over Japan. They plan the invasion of North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy. They debate endlessly about when and where to launch the cross-channel invasion that will liberate France. Churchill pushes for operations in the Mediterranean, seeing opportunities to strike at what he calls the soft underbelly of the Axis. The Americans, particularly General George Marshall, want a direct assault on France as soon as possible. The debates are intense, but the alliance holds. Churchill also forges a working relationship with Joseph Stalin, though this partnership is far more difficult. Stalin is suspicious, brutal, and completely focused on Soviet interests. He demands that Britain and America open a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army. Churchill tries to explain that launching a premature invasion of France would end in catastrophic failure. Stalin interprets this as evidence that the Western Allies want Russia to bear the heaviest burden of fighting Germany. The mutual suspicion never fully disappears, but the three leaders manage to coordinate strategy and maintain the alliance against Hitler. The war grinds forward with agonizing slowness. In North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces fight back and forth across the desert against German and Italian armies. Churchill replaces generals repeatedly, searching for commanders who can deliver victories. Finally, at El Alamein in November 1942, General Bernard Montgomery defeats Rommel's Afrika Korps decisively. Churchill calls it the end of the beginning. A few days later, American forces land in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. The Axis forces in North Africa are caught between two Allied armies. By May 1943, over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrender in Tunisia. The Mediterranean is opening. In July 1943, Allied forces invade Sicily, then cross to the Italian mainland in September. Italy surrenders, though German forces pour into the country to continue the fight. The Italian campaign becomes a brutal slog up the peninsula, each mountain pass and river crossing defended ferociously by German troops. But Churchill sees these operations as essential preparation for the main event. The lessons learned in North Africa and Italy, the techniques of amphibious operations, the coordination between air, sea, and land forces, all of this is building toward the greatest military operation in history. From triumph to rejection. On June 6, 1944, after months of meticulous planning, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion Churchill has both advocated for and worried about, becomes reality. American, British, and Canadian troops land on 5 beaches under heavy German fire. The outcome hangs in the balance for hours. But the Allies establish their beachheads and begin pouring men and equipment into France. Churchill desperately wants to watch the invasion firsthand from a Royal Navy ship, but King George VI, concerned for the Prime Minister's safety, convinces him to stay in England. The battle for France is fierce and costly. German forces defend every hedgerow and village, but the Allies have overwhelming superiority in men, equipment, and air power. By late July, they break out from the Normandy beachhead. In August, Allied forces land in southern France. Paris is liberated on August 25th. By September, Allied armies are approaching Germany's western border. From the east, the Red Army is smashing through Poland toward Berlin. Germany is caught in a closing vice. Churchill travels constantly despite his age. He is now 70 years old, and the strain of 5 years of war leadership shows in his face and health. But he will not rest. He visits troops in France. He flies to Moscow for conferences with Stalin. In February 1945, he joins Roosevelt and Stalin at Yalta on the Black Sea coast to plan the final defeat of Germany and the shape of the post-war world. Roosevelt is visibly failing, exhausted by his own health problems. Stalin dominates the conference, extracting agreements that will give the Soviet Union control over Eastern Europe. Churchill fights to preserve Poland's independence, but he lacks the power to force Stalin to yield. Britain, though on the winning side, is financially exhausted and militarily dependent on American support. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Churchill appears on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with the King and Queen, waving to massive crowds celebrating in the streets. He delivers a victory broadcast to the nation. But the moment is bittersweet. Britain has won, but at enormous cost. The empire is bankrupted. Over 450,000 British military personnel and civilians have died. Cities lie in ruins, the economy is shattered, and Churchill knows that the peace will be dominated by America and the Soviet Union, not by Britain. Negligent with victory achieved in Europe, attention turns to the ongoing war against Japan. But domestic British politics cannot be postponed any longer. There has been no general election since 1935, a decade earlier. The Labour Party, having supported the wartime coalition loyally, now wants to fight an election on its own platform of social reform and economic change. Churchill proposes continuing the coalition until Japan is defeated. Labour refuses. On May 23, 1945, Churchill resigns as Prime Minister of the coalition government. King George VI immediately asks him to form a new conservative government to serve until an election can be held. The election is set for July 5, 1945, but results will not be counted until July 26 to allow time to collect votes from military personnel stationed overseas. Churchill campaigns aggressively, warning that socialism will lead to tyranny and economic ruin. But the British people, grateful as they are for his wartime leadership, are ready for change. They remember the poverty and unemployment of the 1930s. They want the social reforms that Labour promises: the National Health Service, expanded welfare programs, nationalisation of key industries. On July 26, when the results are announced, Labour wins a landslide victory. Churchill's Conservative Party is crushed. He is no longer Prime Minister. The rejection is stunning. Churchill has led Britain through its darkest hour. He has rallied the nation when defeat seemed inevitable. He has forged the grand alliance that destroyed Nazi Germany. And now, before the war against Japan is even over, the British people have voted him out of office. His wife Clementine tries to comfort him, suggesting that it may be a blessing in disguise. Churchill replies that it seems quite effectively disguised. He is 70 years old, exhausted, and cast aside at the moment of victory. Elder statesman. Abandonment. Church at 75, not retire quietly. He remains leader of the opposition, sitting in Parliament and fighting Labour's socialist agenda with the same ferocity he once directed against Hitler. He also returns to writing, beginning work on his massive 6-volume history of the Second World War. The books, published between 1948 and 1954, generate substantial income and cement his reputation as not just a war leader, but as a historian and chronicler of the age. In 1953, he is awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his mastery of historical and biographical description and for his brilliant oratory defending human values. Foreground. But Churchill's most important contribution in these years comes not in Parliament, but in a small college town in Missouri. On March 5, 1946, Churchill travels to Fulton, Missouri, at President Harry Truman's invitation to give a speech at Westminster College. His address, titled "The Sinews of Peace," becomes known as the Iron Curtain speech. Churchill warns that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe. Behind that curtain, the Soviet Union is imposing communist totalitarianism on the nations of Eastern Europe. Churchill calls for the Western democracies to stand firm against Soviet expansion, to maintain their strength and unity, to resist the new tyranny as they resisted the old. The speech is controversial. Many people, both in America and Britain, still want to believe that Stalin can be a partner in building a peaceful world. They accuse Churchill of warmongering again, of trying to start a new conflict before the last one has fully ended. But within a few years, as Stalin consolidates his grip on Eastern Europe, as the Berlin blockade demonstrates Soviet hostility, as communist movements threaten Greece and other nations, Churchill's analysis is vindicated once more. He has warned of a threat that others refuse to see, and he has been proven right. Manslaughter 1951, the Conservatives win a general election. Churchill, now 76 years old, returns as Prime Minister. But this second premiership is nothing like his wartime leadership. He is old, often ill, conducting government business from his bed. He suffers a serious stroke in 1953 that is kept secret from the public. His powers are declining, though his personality and his reputation remain formidable. His main accomplishment is simply presiding over the Conservative Party's acceptance of the welfare state that Labour created. Churchill, the aristocrat and empire loyalist, does not try to dismantle the National Health Service or reverse the social reforms of the post-war years. On April 5, 1955, Churchill finally resigns as Prime Minister. He remains a Member of Parliament for another 9 years, but rarely speaks in debates. He spends his final decade painting, a hobby he took up decades earlier and which brings him genuine peace. He writes. He enjoys time with his family at Chartwell. He receives visitors and dignitaries from around the world. He watches as his prediction about the Soviet threat proves accurate again and again. He lives long enough to see the Cold War entrench itself as the defining conflict of the post-war era. But he does not live to see its end. The final journey. Chemotherapy. On January 15, 1965, Winston Churchill suffers a massive stroke. He slips into a coma from which he never emerges. For 9 days, he lies unconscious in his London home at 28 Hyde Park Gate while the world waits. His family gathers around him. Bulletins are issued daily on his condition. Everyone knows the end is near. On January 24th, at 8:35 in the morning, his heart finally stops. His last words, spoken to his son-in-law Christopher Soames days earlier when he briefly regained consciousness, were simple and weary. "I'm so bored with it all." Wildfires areas exactly 70 years after his father's death, a coincidence that seems almost literary. Queen Elizabeth II, breaking with recent precedent, decrees that Churchill will be honoured with a state funeral, the first for a commoner since William Gladstone in 1898. The plans for Churchill's funeral, codenamed Operation Hope Not, have been in development since 1953, when he suffered an earlier stroke. Over the years, the plans have been revised repeatedly because, as Lord Mountbatten wryly noted, Churchill kept living, and the pallbearers kept dying. On January 26, Churchill's body is moved from his home to Westminster Hall to lie in state. For 3 days and 3 nights, with only brief closures, the hall remains open to the public. More than 300,000 people file past the catafalque where his coffin rests, guarded by officers from the services. They stand in lines that stretch for miles, waiting hours in the winter cold for the chance to pay their respects. Young and old, rich and poor, they come to say farewell to the man who saved their nation. On the morning of January 30th, the state funeral begins. Big Ben, silent from the moment the procession leaves Westminster, will not chime again until midnight. A 90-gun salute fires in Hyde Park, 1 gun for each year of Churchill's life. The coffin, draped in a Union Jack with his insignia of the Order of the Garter, is placed on a gun carriage. Sailors from the Royal Navy, following a tradition established when the horses bolted at Queen Victoria's funeral, pull the carriage through the streets of London. The route passes Parliament, where Churchill served for 64 years. It passes Downing Street, where he governed during Britain's supreme crisis. Hundreds of thousands line the streets in silence. The procession arrives at St. Paul's Cathedral, where more than 3,000 people have gathered for the funeral service. Representatives from 110 nations attend. 6 sovereigns are present, an unprecedented gathering of royalty. Queen Elizabeth II herself attends, breaking protocol by arriving before the coffin, a gesture of respect for a man who was never a king, but who saved the monarchy and the nation. The service includes stirring hymns, the ones Churchill requested that there should be plenty of. The music and the prayers echo through the great dome of St. Paul's. After the service, the coffin is carried down to the River Thames. It is placed aboard the MV Havengor, a small vessel that will carry it upriver to Festival Pier. As the boat passes, cranes at the London docks lower their jibs in a spontaneous salute from the dock workers. This gesture, unplanned and unofficial, is one of the most moving moments of the day. The working men of London paying tribute to the aristocrat who defended them in their darkest hour. From Festival Pier, the coffin is taken to Waterloo Station and placed on a special funeral train. The locomotive pulling the train is named Winston Churchill, a fitting tribute. As the train travels through the countryside to Oxfordshire, thousands of people stand silently along the tracks. They stand in fields and at crossings, ordinary citizens saying goodbye. The train arrives at Hanborough Station. The coffin is transferred to a hearse for the final short journey to Blaydon. St. Martin's Church in Blaydon is a small country church in the shadow of Blenheim Palace, visible on the hill above. This is where Churchill wanted to be buried, not in Westminster Abbey among kings and poets, but in the family plot beside his mother and father. The committal service is private, only family present. The coffin is lowered into the earth next to Lord Randolph Churchill, the father who never believed in him. After 90 years, Winston has come home. His funeral is watched by 350 million people worldwide on television, the largest viewing audience for any event up to that time. In Britain, 25 million people watch, more than half the population. It is not just a British event, but a global farewell to a man who shaped the 20th century. In death, as in life, Churchill commands the attention of the world. The Immortal Lion. History has been kind to Winston Churchill, but then he helped write it. His 6-volume history of the Second World War shaped how the conflict is understood, emphasizing the lonely British stand in 1940 and the power of the English-speaking peoples working together. His reputation has weathered criticism over his imperial attitudes and some of his wartime decisions. Scholars debate his role in various campaigns and policies, but the essential verdict remains unchanged. When the test came, when the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance, Winston Churchill stood firm. He was not perfect. His judgment failed at Gallipoli. His return to the gold standard hurt Britain's economy. His opposition to Indian independence put him on the wrong side of history. He could be difficult, demanding, temperamental. He drank too much and worked too hard. He drove his staff to exhaustion and sometimes made decisions based on intuition rather than careful analysis. He was an imperialist in an age when empires were dying. But in 1940, in that supreme moment, all of his qualities, good and bad, combined to make him exactly the leader Britain needed. Other politicians might have negotiated with Hitler. A careful, reasonable man might have looked at the military situation in May and June of 1940 and concluded that Britain had no choice but to seek terms. Churchill, unreasonable and defiant, refused to accept the unacceptable. His words gave people courage when courage seemed pointless. His presence in bombed neighborhoods made suffering bearable. His cigars and V signs became symbols of a nation that would not surrender. He turned British stubbornness into a weapon and British resolve into armor. The world he saved was imperfect. The Cold War followed the Hot War. The British Empire dissolved. The balance of power shifted from London to Washington and Moscow. But the alternative, a world dominated by Nazi Germany, was unthinkable. If Churchill had not stood in 1940, if Britain had fallen or made peace, there would have been no arsenal of democracy, no D-Day, no liberation of Europe. The darkness would have fallen, and it might never have lifted. That is why Churchill matters. That is why his legacy endures. In 2002, the BBC conducted a poll to determine the greatest Briton of all time. The results surprised no one. Winston Churchill placed first, ahead of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, Diana Princess of Wales, Charles Darwin, William Shakespeare, and all the kings and queens and scientists and artists and warriors in Britain's long history. The people chose the man who led them through the fire. His words still echo when free people face tyranny. His example still inspires when leaders must choose between comfort and duty. His life demonstrates that one person, armed with courage and eloquence and iron determination, can change the course of history. He was born in a palace, but found his purpose in Parliament. He sought glory on battlefields, but found immortality in the words he spoke when the world was breaking. He failed and fell and rose again. He was cast aside and recalled. He made terrible mistakes and achieved impossible triumphs. On that January morning in 1965, when the announcement came that Winston Churchill had died, people across Britain and around the world stopped what they were doing. Some wept. Many simply stood in silence, remembering. They remembered the voice on the radio promising nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. They remembered the speeches that made them believe they could survive when survival seemed impossible. They remembered the V sign and the cigar and the indomitable spirit that refused to break. They remembered that once, when everything was at stake, Britain had found a leader equal to the hour. The last lion was gone, but the legend would never die. As long as people value freedom over tyranny, courage over fear, determination over despair, Winston Churchill will matter. As long as nations remember that there are things worth fighting for and principles that must not be surrendered, his example will endure. He saved Britain when Britain stood alone. In doing so, he saved the world. That is his legacy, carved not in marble or bronze, but in the living history of free people everywhere. The rain falls on Blaydon Churchyard, on the simple stone that marks his grave. Blenheim Palace stands on the hill above, where his story began 90 years earlier. The earth holds his body, but his spirit lives on in every generation that learns his story, in every leader who must choose courage over compromise, in every person who refuses to surrender to darkness. Winston Churchill, the boy his father thought would amount to nothing, the politician who was cast out and recalled, the man who stood alone when standing alone saved the world. His hour came. He was ready. And he made sure that when it was done, when the reckoning came and the future looked back, men would still say, "This was their finest hour." And they always will.